If you've ever wanted to whip up blankets without using a pattern, but were somewhat reluctant or, let's be honest, scared to do it from scratch, I have a solution for you. I made a step-by-step pattern for a basic blanket called Friendly Blanket. The pattern is highly adjustable and you can use it to make blankets in any size with any chunky yarn you have on hand. The pattern is free. You can download it at 10roseaday.com/friendly-blanket. In this tutorial, we walk through every step of the pattern to help you understand how to knit a blanket. So follow the link over there, get the pattern, and let's get started. To make this blanket, we'll need only three things: yarn, needles, and a wool needle. The wool needle will have to wait till the end of the project. We'll only use it to hide the tail, so I'm gonna put it aside for now. When it comes to the yarn, use any chunky yarn that has the equivalent of 50 meters or 55 yards in a 50-gram balls. I'm gonna use this thick and thin wool slub in variegated color. This yarn is perfect for a beginner project because the color and the texture of the yarn combined with the seed stitch that we're going to use will hide all sorts of imperfections and even some mistakes. So I'm going to use this yarn, and as to the needles, we'll need a pair of 12 millimeter US size 17 needles. If you plan to make a wide blanket like the one featured in the pattern, it's better to use circular needles to avoid the additional strain on the wrists and arms. Or you can, if you like to work with the single pointed needles, then you can use those as well. So now that we have all the materials in place, let's get started. So find the end of the yarn. It could be from inside the ball or outside the ball, doesn't really matter at all. And let's cast on stitches. The pattern tells us to cast on 81 stitches. But you can cast on any number of stitches you like, and the number of stitches you cast on will determine the width of the blanket. So to get the blanket featured in the pattern, that is 19 centimeters, 35 and a half inches wide, you will need to cast on 81 stitches. But you can make the blanket as wide as you want. I will make a tiny sample blanket, so I'm gonna cast on just 11 stitches just to show you that you can adjust the size of the blanket drastically, and also to show you how to work through the blanket without making this video incredibly long. As to the type of cast on, you can use any type of cast on you like, but it is simpler to use a short tail cast on like knitted cast on. Why? Because we don't have to estimate the length of the tail before we start casting on stitches. So knitted cast on, make a slip knot, simply make a loop with the working yarn on top of the yarn tail, then place that loop on top of the working yarn, hold the strand in the middle and the tail and pull it up to make your first stitch. Now take one of the needles in your left hand and place this stitch on the needle, then pull the working yarn to adjust the size of the stitch. Don't make it too tight, it should be loose enough to comfortably slide on the needle. Now take the other needle and to cast on more stitches, insert the tip of the right needle into the stitch from left to right, just like you are knitting. Then wrap the tip of the right needle with the yarn, pull the wrap through, basically knitting through that stitch, but instead of slipping the stitch off the left needle, we are placing the new stitch on the left needle, just like this. Now we have two stitches. So we're going to repeat the same thing, knitting through the first stitch from the tip of the left needle, making a new stitch, placing it on the left needle. And keep doing that until you get as many stitches as you need. If you're gonna follow the pattern, then cast on 81 stitch, or you can cast on any number of stitches you like, but make sure it is an odd number of stitches. So I'm gonna cast on 11 stitches just to keep this tutorial quick, and we'll still work through all steps of the pattern anyways, regardless of the number of stitches we cast on. Okay, let's see how many stitches I have so far. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Just 2 more stitches to go, and we can move on to the next step. 1 and 2. Okay, here we go. We have all the stitches we need. I mean, I have just a few, you probably have more, it doesn't matter. We can move on. As long as you have all the stitches that you plan to use, you can move on to the next step. And the next step would be to work in the seed stitch. This stitch is known as a moss stitch in the UK, as I've recently learned, so I'm going to use 2 names: seed stitch or moss stitch if you are a UK knitter. The pattern row is fairly simple. We knit 1 stitch and then we purl 1 stitch. So with the yarn at the back of the work, we knit 1 stitch, slip it. This time we slip it off the needle. Then bring the yarn to the front, purl 1 stitch, then yarn to the back, knit 1 stitch, yarn to the front, purl 1 stitch, and keep going until you get to the last stitch of the row, and that stitch will be a knit. So basically we repeat the same knit, purl, but because we are doing it an odd number of times, then we end up with an odd stitch, and that stitch will be a knit. And that's about it. Just turn your work and repeat the same thing, the same pattern row. Knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and so on and so forth until you get to the last stitch. Knit it and then turn your work and keep going in the same pattern row. Because we have an odd number of stitches, we only have 1 pattern row that is the same for all rows, because with this stitch we would have to have a different row 2, instructions for row 2, if we had an even number of stitches. But we are smart, so we cast on odd number of stitches right away to save ourselves the trouble to remember whether it's the first row or the second pattern row. Now we don't have to worry about that at all. So we keep working, repeating the same pattern row as you see, as I've been doing so far, and I'll work for a few rows and then we'll stop and I'll show you how to join a new ball of yarn. Because you're making a blanket, you're gonna use quite a bit of yarn. For the blanket featured in the pattern, you'll need 750 meters, that's 825 yards of yarn, and that means you will use a number of balls and you will have to join that yarn, new balls once in a while, and in just a few rows I'll show you how to do it. Okay, I've made a few rows and I noticed that I'm running out of yarn. Of course, I haven't used the whole ball to make this little piece. I simply cut the yarn, but in real life at some point we will run out of yarn, and that would be the time when we have to attach a new ball of yarn. So how do we do that? First of all, because this yarn doesn't have a lot of yardage, so it's a chunky yarn, right? And because the pattern is quite forgiving, it's okay to join the yarn in the middle of the row, just to save the yarn, because we don't want to waste so much yarn, especially if we are working on a wider blanket. But if you feel that whether you're using a different type of yarn or for some other reason you feel that joining the yarn at the middle of the row will affect the look of the blanket, then join the yarn at the beginning of the row. But I'm okay with joining in the middle of the row, and here's how we're gonna do it. With the yarn like this, that is thick and thin, textured and in variegated color, we'll use the simplest method out there. So simply overlap 2 strands, and with the thick and thin yarn, it's better to match, to overlap kind of the thick piece over here with the thin piece in the other yarn, the new yarn. So overlap the strands like this, and then simply use the strands held together to work 3 or 4 stitches. just like this. See, I'm using 2 strands together. So I worked 3 stitches. I will probably work 1 more stitch. I will have enough yarn for that. Just like this. And then let go of the tail and continue knitting with the ball, with the yarn from the new ball. If you're using a yarn that has 2 or more plies, it's better to join a new ball of yarn with the technique explained in a tutorial that you can find at 10rowsaday.com/split-join. But this technique of overlapping is the simplest and the easiest, and it usually works when you're working with chunky yarn, especially if it is in variegated color and especially if it's a textured yarn. So once you join the new ball of yarn, simply continue working in the same pattern. Knit 1, purl 1 up to the last stitch, and then knit the last stitch. And we do it for basically as long as we want. The blanket that is featured in the pattern is quite long. It's 180 centimeters, that's 70 inches long. But you can stop anytime. Whenever you feel happy about the length of the blanket, just stop and bind off stitches. Or if you use up the yarn that you have on hand and you don't want to buy more yarn, then simply whenever you feel that you're running out of yarn, just stop and bind off the stitches. How do you know when to stop to make sure that you have enough yarn to bind off? So simply measure the tail that you have left, and it should be at least 4 times the width of the fabric. So if you measure like this and you have a tail this long, then you are good to go to start binding off stitches. If you have a way longer tail, then probably you will have enough for another row. So it's totally up to you. Like I said, this pattern is highly adjustable, and you can adjust the width by casting on any number of stitches you like, and you can adjust the length by working for as many rows as you want, or until the blanket is of the length that you want to make. So simply keep going, just same pattern, same yarn, just attaching the new balls of yarn here and there, and work until you are ready to bind off stitches. Okay, I'm happy with the length of my blanket. It's going to be a good blanket for a doll or a kitten, let's say, or some other tiny pet. And now I'm ready to bind off stitches. How do we do that? We bind off stitches in pattern. And that means that we work in the same seed stitch pattern, but we pass 1 stitch over the other. So we knit 1 stitch, then purl 1 stitch. Now we insert the needle into the stitch that we knit and pass it over the purl stitch and off the needles. Now we knit the next stitch, pass 1 stitch over the other, purl the next stitch, pass 1 stitch over the other. Keep the stitches fairly loose, because you don't want the bind off edge to be tight and jam the whole project. Keep them loose, same as the stitches that you've been knitting and purling, so they should be loose enough to comfortably slide on a needle. And keep binding off stitches in pattern. Keep knitting and purling until you have just 1 stitch left, and we'll get there in a moment. Okay, the last knit stitch, pass it over. Now we put the needles aside, cut the yarn, or if you're working until you to use up all the yarn that you have until you run out of yarn, then you won't need probably to cut the yarn. So simply pull this tail through the last loop like this and pull tight to secure. So the blanket is ready, and the last step would be, the last mandatory step will be to hide the tails, and that's when we need the wool needle. So we take the wool needle, thread the yarn tail into the wool needle, and simply hide, because this blanket doesn't have a right side or a wrong side. It really doesn't matter where you hide the tails, but I choose to do it on one side at least. And because the pattern is so textured, then it won't be visible in most cases. But like I said, if you decided to join the new balls of yarn and not in the middle of the row but at the beginning of the row, then your tails will be all nicely aligned somewhere in this area. And then we run the wool needle through several stitches to simply kind of snake it through the stitch to hide the tail, but make sure you split the yarn as you go. And it's usually better, I mean less visible, let's say, if you do it diagonally. So if you go this way, then it will be less visible. Or if you do it at the edges, then you can hide the tail within the edge. So weaving in tails is quite creative process, so there are no set rules. So just do it depending on the project and depending on how you want it to look and where you feel that it will be hidden more securely and less visible. So I'm going to do it within the edge because I'm at the bind off edge here. So I'm going to run the needle through several stitches over here. And like I said, split the yarn. So try to get the needle inside the strand as often as you can. So basically, I'll try to do it every time that I get into a new stitch. I'll try to split the yarn. If it's not easy to do it every time, that's okay to do it just a few times. It doesn't really matter. Don't make your life too complicated. So see, that's how it looks. That's how I run the needle through the yarn. And now I can pull the tail through, basically hiding it. Because the blankets get a lot of stretch in all sorts of directions, right? Then it's a good idea to stretch the blanket right now to make sure that you have enough yarn over here to hide, to keep the tail in the fabric. If you feel that it won't be too bulky, it's a good idea to make at least one step back, just like this, again splitting the yarn. If you feel it's too bulky for your project and it will be too visible, then don't do that. Especially if you're using wool yarn, it's gonna felt, fibers are gonna felt to each other, and then as you start using the blanket, and then the tails will be hidden and they will never get out of their hiding spot. So it's totally up to you. I'm just giving you options. So once you're happy with the tail, it's been stretched well, you have enough fabric over here, enough yarn over here, then simply trim the tail like this and move on to the next tail. So we need to go one by one and hide them all. If the tail is short, like this one, then don't get the tail into the wool needle as yet. First, run the wool needle as you would as if the tail was there, just like this. So I'm simply running. See, the needle is empty. I'm simply running it through several stitches, trying to split the yarn. And then when you're ready with the setup, that's when you insert the tail into the wool needle like this. And then simply pull it through. Then relax the fabric, make sure you have enough yarn in there. And see, I don't even have to trim anything because the tail was so short, it just stays there. And then do the same thing with every tail until you have no more tails left in your project. And this was my last tail. And now my miniature blanket is ready. No tails. It's all nice and tiny. Well, tiny. The last step that we have in the pattern is the step that says block to measurements. So it is a good idea to block any project, blanket or scarf or whatever else you're making. It's a good idea to block it. What does it do to the fabric? First of all, it evens out the stitches, and it also makes the blanket or any other project, it makes it nicely shaped, because when we block, we would steam it or wet it somehow, and then we would stretch it, and then we would put it on a towel and make it really nice and straight. All the edges are aligned, so it will, and let it dry, and that would be a great way to make this blanket look perfect. But if you don't have time, or if you don't want to, then it's okay to skip this step, because for blankets, as you start using it, you will stretch it anyways, and the stitches will eventually even out. And with the stitch pattern like this, that is quite messy in itself, it's not really a big deal if the stitches are a bit kind of off. So if you want to make it perfect, then block it. If you want to just move on to the next project and leave it as it is, it's also fine. As you get to know this pattern, feel free to experiment with different stitch patterns. For more information about that, go to 10rowsaday.com/blanket-without-pattern. Thank you for watching this video and have a wonderful week. I'll see you in the next tutorial.